Hey friends. So in this video, we're going to talk about the second concept that gets introduced, the notion of human nature. Now, our authors note that Confucius didn't have much to say about human nature in the sort of the work attributed to him, the Analects. Um, but a later Confucian thinker, Mencius, had a lot to say about human nature as as a capacity for sort of spontaneous action that's shared by all human beings. So just interesting and important distinctions to make. So now we could think of human nature, the goal of, well, the goal of reflecting on human nature is a kind of self-cultivation to bring out what's already present in the self. Right? So in other words, why do we engage in this process of self-cultivation that we talked about a little bit in the previous video? It's that there's already inside of us the things we should do, right? The kinds of people we should be. And we cultivate the self in order to bring that out. So the person you ought to be is sort of buried in you. And we engage in self-cultivation to bring that individual out. It's kind of hard to talk about this without using sort of homuncular terms where we talk about the person inside of us, but it's something like the kind of person we are meant to be, right, is latent, right? We all have the capacity, the power to become the kind of person we're meant to be. And self-cultivation brings that out. Now, from there, we have a few different views on the relationship or what's part of the self and how we ought to think about it. So for Mencius, we focus on what's under our control, right? Particularly in cases of failure, right? So whenever we fail at something, whenever we don't live up to the kind of person we're meant to be, Mencius has us reflect on how we can do better, right? How one can do better by focusing in particular on things that are under your control. Now, a kind of Daoist thinker, Zhuangzi, tells us that human nature is malleable. So in other words, while Mencius thinks that human nature is fixed and static across all individuals, Zhuangzi thinks that our nature is changeable. So when we're focusing on self-cultivation, we should focus on non-deliberate action. In other words, what's done spontaneously. Now, third, we have the Buddhists, right? The Buddhist tradition within sort of the Eastern philosophical tradition. And the Buddhists are kind of interesting ones because they argue that there's no such thing as the self or the world, right? That both are illusory. So to call it self-cultivation is disingenuous. It's more like cultivating our Buddha nature, our Buddhahood, right? So it's not that we're trying to bring out something that's in us. It's rather we have this ideal that we try to live up to. Right? But there is no self involved with all of this, right? The idea of a self is illusory for Buddhists. So one thing that's interesting here, an interesting contrast to the Cartesian notion of a mind or self, is that these conceptions of the self all have ethical dimensions to them, right? For the Neo-Confucians, we focus on how to be better. For Zhuangzi, we focus on spontaneity, right? And sort of doing what comes naturally to us. Right? Presumably that's, sort of being a good citizen and, and sort of living up to the role that we should be living in. For the Buddhists, we have some kind of ideal, some goal we're striving towards, right? So in all of these cases, we have a kind of telos, a kind of teleology, right? That is to say that we are aimed towards something, right? We're making progress towards something. But on the Cartesian view of the self, we don't have that. There's no ethical dimension to the Cartesian view of the self. It is purely a metaphysical construct. And so I think this is one or another interesting way in which to draw the distinction between the Cartesian tradition and the classical Chinese traditions, right? The role of moral considerations when we're thinking about the self.